Hi everyone. I want to talk to you today about a difficult subject, which is that it's not easy being green. Having to spend each day the color of the leaves. When I think it could be nicer being red or yellow or gold or something more colorful like that. So anyway, it's not easy being green. And that's why today's lecture is called Cutthroat Chorusing, the Dangerous Life of the Singing Frog. Here's a little overview. What is a frog? Do frogs sing? How do they produce sound? What is different about hearing and singing on land versus in water? What types of sounds do frogs make and how are they structured? In what sorts of contexts do frogs make sounds? In other words, what do frog songs mean? What kinds of interactions occur between singers? What goes on in the mind of a frog listener? Who's in charge? In other words, does singing drive the evolution of listening or vice versa? And finally, a little conclusion about how it isn't easy, as we just saw, to be green. So first question, what's a frog? Frogs are one of the three main groups of amphibians alive today. Three groups are called lissamphibians, and the ones that include the extinct species are just the amphibians. You don't need to know that, but just thought I'd throw it in there. So if we took amphibians around 300 million years ago, there's amphibian-type beings moving up on land. And then around 265 million years ago, they branch off into these different groups. And then you start to find some fossil species of anurans around 200 million years ago. So the group of frogs and toads is called anurans. And there's not a formal distinction between a frog and a toad. All toads are frogs. And some people distinguish by saying toads have dry skin and frogs have wet skin. But that's just a superficial characteristic. It's not based on their phylogenetic history. So anurans make up 88% of the amphibian species. The caudates, the caudata, the salamanders and newts are a smaller group, and Gymnophiona, the caecilians, are also a smaller group. So anurans are most of the amphibians. Amphibians evolved from lobe-finned fish. The representatives of those today are lungfish and coelacanths, but actually all of us, all amniotes, all reptiles, birds, mammals, we're all derived from the lobe-finned fish. Tiktaalik, we read about earlier on. That's the fish that had lobe fins that was sort of walked up on land. It might have been one of the ancestors of amphibians and us. So that was happening around here around 375 million years ago. Lobe-finned fish existed, evolved around here 419 million years ago. So there's some remaining today. But most of the fish are the ray-finned fish. 99% of fish are ray-finned, the fish alive today. These are the bony fish. Here's your cartilaginous fish. If we start with vertebrates, and all the vertebrates were here, and then lampreys and hagfish kind of like went off, and then everyone else developed jaws, I guess you could say. Jaws is interesting because Jaws is a shark, and sharks are cartilaginous fish, but all the other fish that are not the cartilaginous ones are the bony fish, and the bony fish, all the fish that are still fish today are ray-finned fish, but then the lobe-finned fish ended up producing amphibians, and then all the amniotes, reptiles, birds, mammals, amphibians, everything here, and we're going to talk about frogs today. Yeah, just a few things here. Like if you looked at amphibians today and said, what is an amphibian? They do live on both water and land. They have a water youth and usually a land adulthood. They have lungs, which is new because our fish didn't really have lungs. They have fleshy paired front and back appendages. They get that from the lobe-finned fish, which allows them to walk up on land. They exchange air through the skin, which is why they often need moisture, and they still require water to breed. Like they have to lay the eggs in water to keep them moist, and that's different from amniotes. Reptiles developed, and birds have it too, the ability to lay eggs that could survive on land without drying out. And the mammals, of course, keep the eggs inside the body. And then metamorphosis, we're not going to talk about it, but tadpoles, of course, the young stage of amphibians, and they're pretty fishy, aquatic. And then adult form is the terrestrial frog type, and that's the one we're going to be talking about. So just looking at this picture, we've seen this before, and I'm just adapting it to show amphibians. Last time we were looking at fish, and before that we looked at insects. But if we take all organisms, eukaryotes, animals, bilateral animals, the deuterostomes, chordates, vertebrates, and of the vertebrates you have the fish, and then amphibians come off of one branch of fish. And then we're looking specifically at the anurins, which are the frogs and the toads. And then one last view of this same idea, just different picture. We also saw this in a previous presentation. If we look at our ancestry as humans, we are humans. We are related to all great apes. All great apes are related to all the other apes. All the apes are related to all the primates, right? Monkeys and apes, you could say, diverge there. All the mammals here, all the amniotes, if we include the reptiles and birds, all the tetrapods, we include the amphibians. That's where we get that. And before that, we have all the bony vertebrates, and that includes the bony fish, teleosts, ray fin fish, cartilaginous fish, lampreys, insects. That's how far away these guys were. But now we're looking at amphibians. So, first question, do frogs sing? You know this from the song that I sang at the beginning of the presentation, which was by Kermit, and he's a frog. So yes, frogs sing. Frogs are among the most vocal groups of species on the planet. Some frog species don't sing, and I actually don't know what percentage of frog species sing or don't sing, but I think that most of them do. There's some cases where the males don't sing, but the females do. There's some cases where the frogs are mostly visual because they mate during the day, for instance, or because they live near a very noisy source like a waterfall or a stream. The sounds they make influence the response tendencies of others. So when we say, do frogs make sounds? Yeah, sure, they make sounds. When we say, do they sing? We could say, well, what does singing mean? And one way of thinking about it is that we know that those sounds are communicative, meaning they influence what listeners do. So it doesn't mean, if you tell someone to do something, they're not always going to do it. But if they understand what you mean and you influence what they're likely to do, then it is communicative in that way. So frog vocalizations are at least communicative. And this doesn't mean that they transmit information, like in the dry information sense, like, oh, I know that you want this, but that they manipulate. They're likely to influence your responses one way or the other. So we'll talk about this more in later presentations, but information in the dispassionate sense is really secondary to affect manipulation. Affect manipulation has to develop first, and then it's only after that you could have a sort of free-floating information that we do have with humans, like a dictionary. A dictionary is free-floating information. So then we might ask, so we know that frogs sing, and they sing in order to be communicative and influence others, but why? So one thing to note is that vocalization in frogs is always related to mating. Sometimes it takes place between rival singers, but usually they're competing for mates. So it's communicative, but it's not just like, oh, it's nice weather. It's something to do with mating, with courtship. So you might be singing to attract mates. You might be singing to defend your territory so you can mate in that territory. And then we can ask, does it work? Are frogs just singing and then they get to mate, but the mating doesn't have anything to do with the singing? Or does the singing actually make the mating more successful? So we know that it does work. So one thing that you can do is hide a little tiny speaker that's playing a male advertisement call. And you can see that just the sound itself is sufficient to induce positive phonotaxis, right? Movement, hopping over toward the speaker in gravid females, gravid meaning full of eggs, ready to lay. And then it can also do that in rival males who might be like, I want to go sing near where that other guy is singing. And then it can also induce negative phonotaxis if someone doesn't want to hear that mating call. And also it can influence the rate at which another singer is singing. So it does influence others' behavior, and it really can attract mates. And the other interesting thing is that just hearing song influences the hormone levels. So hearing male song can influence a female's readiness to mate and interest in doing so. And I believe it can do a similar thing for males as well. Then what's also interesting is that hormone levels influence the auditory sensitivity. So if hearing the song influences the hormones, and then the hormones influence the hearing, then this creates a feedback loop. So let's look at this. What's in a frog song. That's Kermit, by the way. It's not a Pacific chorus frog. I'm not sure why that's there. So, song versus call. Sometimes these two things are distinguished. We won't really be distinguishing them in this presentation, but we'll talk about it a little bit here. Are all vocalizations that a frog makes song, or some of those things better just called calls? Songs and calls can be distinguished, and you could do that by either structure or function. If it's structure, the song, something that's a song is typically longer and more complex than a call. And if it's function, song is intended to allure rather than deter or turn away certain others. So in other words, a song is intended more to induce positive phonotaxis, and a call might be intended to just simply induce negative phonotaxis. Among the song types, so it turned apparently it used to be thought that each frog usually only had about one song, but now it is known that just about all frog species have at least 3 or 4 song types, or song or call types. A very common one is an advertisement call for mating. And then in some species, there's also a courtship call. The advertisement call would be louder and heard from far away. And then the courtship call, if the species has one, would be used to when a mate is near and has kind of chosen the singer, but isn't yet ready to mate. So the courtship call could be influential in that way. And then the amplexant call. So amplexus is when frogs are going to mate. I think the male mounts the female and then can stay on for as long as 24 hours or maybe even more. So they're in that's called amplexus. They're in amplexus for a long time. Other males try to shake him off because she lays her eggs and then he puts sperm on them as the eggs come out. And that's a process. So he will sometimes give a call during amplexus. And then there's some other call types that are more for aggressive defensive reasons. So if you're being aggressive against others of your same species, so presumably other rival males, you could have a territorial call. You could have a release call, which is when you're clasped and you want to be let go. And females give that when they're not interested in mating with a certain male. You can have an encounter call, which is when you're about to fight, and you have a fighting call when you're fighting. And not all species have all these calls, but these are all possibilities. And then you have defense calls, which is against predators. So you would think that any kind of a fear response or aggression would all be the same thing, but it's really fundamentally different if you're communicating with someone else of your species, because there are rules of dominance. Whereas when you're communicating with a predator, there's nothing you can do, nothing you could say that is going to change whether a predator wants to eat you. But you have alarm calls, distress calls, and warning calls, and those can sometimes get you some help from others or just scare the predator away. And then a single vocalization could serve multiple functions. A same vocalization could attract mates and defend territory, and it might have individual components that do the two different things, or it could all be one big long thing that does both things. We saw with crickets that they had trill and a chirp, and one of those that's all within the same call, but one of them would attract mates, the other one would defend territory. And then one last thing is that the different call or song types could grade into one another rather than be categorically distinct. So you might have an aggressive call, like a sort of weak aggressive call that could get stronger and stronger in some way if an encounter is getting more and more intense. Croaking without choking. And your frog can sing. Say you've seen 7 wonders and your bed is green, but you can't see me. You can't see me. Warning, singing can be dangerous, and we're going to talk about that in the next slide, but just wanted to start you off there. Frogs can produce sounds in 3 different ways. They can pressure air out through the larynx, as do other tetrapods. That's us, we're tetrapods. That includes amphibians, reptiles, birds, mammals. So that's expiratory singing, because you expire it. You could also inspire. You can bring in the air, directing air inward through the larynx. So outward singing is inward singing is And then you could, of course, click your laryngeal folds together if you were a frog that was mostly living underwater. There's no airflow involved, and that's why they do it underwater. So that actually sounds a lot like a fish. So frogs have a buccal cavity, which is the mouth, and they can pump air into the lungs that way, and they can use this vocal sac under the chin for the same reason. So sometimes what they do, instead of without breathing, they pass air over the larynx from the lungs to the mouth or the air sac or the vocal sac, and then back again without breathing. So it could be passed from the mouth cavity to the lungs and back, or it could be passed from the air sac, which is beneath the chin, from to the lungs and then back again. So this is an example of what it was like in early frogs, and some of the frogs still do this, and I guess they do this when they live in the water still. So this is like the earlier Aneurin method. They bring in air through the nostril by opening up the buccal cavity or just opening up the air sac. I'm just going to call it the air sac. So they're bringing down this compartment that's pulling in air in here. Then as they push it back, the nostril's closed, and then it pushes the air into the lungs. Okay. Then they bring the air sac out, and it pulls the air from the lungs back into the mouth, and then they open the nostril, and then they push it in, and it goes out. So you don't actually need to do all those steps. You can do them both at the same time by pulling out the air sac that brings in air from both directions, and then you push it back out again, and it sends air in both directions. So I guess that's the more derived version, the later amphibian version, which most frogs living on land do. As I mentioned, singing can be dangerous. You can see this frog is unfortunately about to be eaten by a bat. Frogs can't see terribly well in the dark, and bats are certainly not blind, but they can use sound, right, to know what's going on in the dark. So yeah, all animals do see less well at night. Some of them see better than others, but they all see not very well. And to attract a mate at night, you have to make a loud sound. So your mate knows of your presence and can locate you. However, the same sounds you make to allure mates also lure predators, as you can see here. It's sick, but mates even seem to like it when you tempt fate in this way. If you can attract attention, and yet you haven't been eaten yet, you're just that much hotter. Here's what you can do. If you detect a predator, stop singing. On dark nights, sing a little bit less. When possible, sing with others. That's right, because timing your signals precisely makes you harder to single out from the rest. But remember, if you can attract attention and yet you haven't been eaten yet, you're just that much hotter. Or you can just eat the bat. So let's look in more detail at expiratory singing. Expiratory singing happens through contraction of the flank musculature. So sides of the ribs and the abdominal muscles and stuff like that, just like we have. These are the abs. These are the oblique muscles. So you can do this in two ways. You can have continuous airflow, so and you can just close the vocal cords while you're doing that, which creates passive oscillations. Right? Or you can repetitively contract the trunk muscles and you close the vocal cords, which gives you and you might have more noisy sounds in that way. And I can only do it about that fast, but some frogs can do it quite rapidly, as we will see. So each muscular pulsation of the oblique muscles ends up producing a different sound pulse. And we're going to see an example from the American toad, first of all. So that's all one contraction. This is passive. So listen, watch, he fills his chest cavity with air. So he's filling his lungs with air. Now he's going to push it out gradually. And it's all being pushed out, and it's creating that passive pulse frequency. Right here he's doing the buccal pumping to pump oxygen back into the chest. Take another example. This is a spring peeper. So in the background of the previous video, there were spring peepers. We now get to see a spring peeper. And what's going to happen is this guy at first is giving his advertisement call, which is like a peep. But then there's a neighbor that's trilling sort of off screen. So at some point he's like, I'm going to stop doing the advertisement call and I'm going to trill back. That's his advertisement call. You can watch his abdomen. But there's the trill. You hear it? Okay, so now he's going to start trilling. There you go. So he's getting mad at his neighbor. These videos and some of the pictures are by Michael Bernard, who has a great site. I think it's called MrToad.com or something like that. So let's look at some examples of this. We already talked about what expiratory singing is. So an example of these two frogs, these guys look different here, but they're actually indistinguishable. They just happen to also blend in with their surroundings. So they're blending in with two different things. They're closely related. The only way you can tell them apart is their vocalization. Now, the vocalization just has different pulsed rates. So the top one has a rate of 25 times a second. I actually timed myself rolling my R's, and that's 25 times a second. So H. chrysochelys makes a sound at 50 times a second, so twice that rate. So it actually is going to sound very different. So even though they look similar and they have similar apparatus, the way they make sounds, but they end up making very different sounds because one of them makes a sound at twice the rate of the other. And it turns out that in both species, their little trunk muscles are pulsing at 25 times a second, but in the top one, H. versicolor, each trunk pulsation produces just one vocal pulse, whereas in H. chrysochelys, each trunk pulsation produces two vocal pulses. Let's give a listen. So watch his chest, vibrating very quickly, and produces high-pitched trill. Now this is going to be the slower trill. So apparently his chest is pulsing at the same rate, and he's just producing one pulse per chest. Okay, so they're very closely related. They look nearly identical, but their sounds are very different, even though they're using almost the same mechanism to produce them. It's just like one variable changes, but it makes it a very distinct sound. Similar biological mechanism can produce notably distinct sonic result. Okay, so let's talk about sound and structure in frog song. We know about their means of producing sound as through expiratory action or inspiratory action or non-respiratory action. We maybe have not yet talked about the fact that they can use the air sac for resonance. I think we talked about that, but also the body wall, so the size of the body, for resonance, amplification, certain things like that. And then we mentioned the active versus passive mechanisms would be muscular activity for each sound, and then passive would be one muscular activity in the torso that's sending air through the larynx, and then it's creating a passive oscillation or vibration. Okay, you also have tone-type sounds versus noise-type sounds. The noises could be pulses or clicks, and I want to give you two examples of just different types of sounds that frogs make. The first one, the green frog, is sometimes said to sound like a loose banjo string. That's his torso. So torso sends the air out. Kind of caught by the vocal sac and then sent back. Watch the water vibrate too. Well, I guess we missed that. And let's take a look at one more, the green tree frog. And this one kind of sounds like a honking horn, or maybe a saxophone. Watch his body to see which are the sounds he's producing versus the chorus in the background. Any given song could have amplitude changes over time, loudness from one song to another or within a song, and then the timbre could change. So when you really do have a plucked banjo string, amplitude is loud at the beginning and it's noisy in terms of timbre, and then it usually settles into a harmonic tone and quieter. So it would be interesting to look at the spectrum of the green frog's song or call and see if that's similar to an actual banjo string. And then something that's interesting when you're comparing species of frog is to note that if you have two closely related species, they often have the same, they'll have the same physiology, same way of producing sounds. And so the way they distinguish themselves from one another is to alter the timing of the call elements. They can't really change the elements themselves as well, but they can change the timing. And so they learn to recognize their own species based on the timing of the sounds. So now let's look at acoustics, the stage, and how the stage influences the sounds made. So lower frequencies travel farther than higher frequencies. This is something that just happens across all of nature. You can think about if you've ever, there's a live concert outside far, a couple blocks from where you are. And as you're walking toward it, you can hear the low sounds better. And as you get closer and closer, you hear the higher frequencies. And the same is roughly the case when someone is in the room next to you listening to music and the lower frequencies make it through the wall. The higher frequencies are getting blocked by the wall. So there's something similar there. The environment that the frog is in influences which frequencies are produced. So you might want to think that the frog would want to produce low sounds then, but the small body size of the frog makes it so that even if they could produce low sounds with vocal cords, they wouldn't be able to resonate those low songs with just the body. So there's certain tricks that they can use. One of them I find very interesting is to sing from an elevated perch. So it turns out that when you sing from an elevated perch, which is like a stage, this produces the least amount of distortion, like filtering from the ground beneath you, the least amount of change to the frequency spectrum of the sound you're producing. You can use acoustic baffles, just like if you're a chorus and on stage behind you, you have baffles that are making the sound all go forward and not go backward. You can use leaves in the same way if you're a tiny little frog. And we saw this with cricket moles or mole crickets, that they, in 2 videos ago, that they dig into the ground, they produce a horn-shaped hole, which then amplifies and directs their song. And frogs can do the same sorts of things using resonating chambers or exponential horns from burrows. So the habitat that a frog is in, habitat differences between two species, actually account for a considerable amount of variation in the call frequency and the frequency spectrum. So the temporal, or the fundamental frequency, the frequency spectrum, and then some of the temporal properties. So in the same way that if you are a musician of a human sort, and you're playing in two different halls, one of them's pretty dry, one of them's really wet. In the wet hall, you usually have to play slower because the reverb makes it so that the sound dies away less quickly, and it can otherwise get pretty muddy. So the same thing is going to be the case for frogs. If there's a lot of reverberation, they might adjust the temporal structure to slow down stuff. If those spaces, if the pauses between sounds are important to be heard, then they might have to actually slow down the call to make sure that those spaces are still there. Also, depending on what the surroundings are, it'll filter the sound in different ways. So they might need to adjust the frequency spectrum by putting more energy in the higher or lower frequencies or something like that. So let's talk about what songs mean in frogs. Before we talked about the different types of song and call, so advertisement songs, territorial songs, defensive songs or calls. We also briefly mentioned changes that you might have in the song structure. So if you have an aggressive call that starts mildly aggressive, but then if whoever you're being aggressive with is not going away, then you might amp up how aggressive your call is by making it louder, making it faster, reducing the spaces between, increasing the calling rate. So changes in the song structure that would affect the meaning. Simply just repeating the song more and more and more rapidly with smaller amount of space between iterations of the same song. That's another thing that conveys intensity. We will see something on a later page about what happens when frogs are interacting in choruses. But basically, you can have, you sing, and then your neighbor sings, and then you sing again, and then your neighbor sings. That's antiphony. If you sing at the exact same time as your neighbor, that would be homophony. And we saw that you might want to do that to reduce predation. And then cacophony would be, not really giving any attention to what your neighbor's doing at all. When we're talking about what songs mean, it's important to think about what an honest signal is versus a dishonest signal in evolution. So an honest signal gives a sense of I guess, like what your mate is getting out of the bargain if she chooses you. And the dishonest signal is, let's say, songs convey body size, but if you develop a way of producing a song that's lower that suggests that you're bigger than you actually are, then that would be a kind of dishonest signal. Then if females start preferring those low sounds, even though they don't relate to body size, then that would be a case of runaway evolution. So singing requires a lot of aerobic energy. The metabolic rate can be increased by 100% all the way up to 220%. So that really is a lot of activity. So females, if they're interested in how aerobically active a male is able to be, they might listen for how much they are singing. That it could be how long the songs are or how much they're repeating the songs. The pulse rate of a song, as we saw, could be active or passive. So that might be something that she's listening to. In each versicolor, which is the gray tree frog, or gray frog of some sort that we listened to on a previous page, each pulse of it requires the body wall contraction. So it's active, it's high metabolic demand. It was what I just did, but a lot faster. And then with each microcephala, closely related species, and I think, but it's just using a single contraction. And the pulses are generated by passive amplitude modulation. So it could be something like anything like that. So the long call is more difficult to produce than the short call. And so for the same amount of metabolic activity, you could produce a small number of long calls or a high number of short calls. So you can choose, that could be a choice you make, long call at low rate versus short call at high rate. And then that might be influenced by how dense or sparse the chorus is around you. If it's very dense, if there's a lot of other callers, you might want to just do a few long calls, but not very often. Or conceivably, in the same exact context, you might want to do a whole bunch of short calls because your long calls maybe get drowned out by the others. I mean, it depends. And then the size of the body influences the fundamental frequency and the resonance. So those tend to be honest signals, but they could also be used dishonestly. So let's now look at sex and gender in frog song. Hormones have a big influence on song. So androgens influence the brain to want to sing, and they also influence the shape of the larynx when the organism is growing up, and the muscles of the trunk. Hormones influence auditory sensitivity and selectivity. So sensitivity is just being able to hear a certain sound at a certain dynamic level. Selectivity is whether you decide to hop toward it, how selective you are. So in most of what we've been talking about so far, we've been talking about male song, but in many different frog species, females sing. There's some species in which the males are mute and the females are the ones who sing. And then there's some cases when both females and males sing. And I think it's the case that they always would sing a different sort of song. And females, I believe in most species, make at least release calls and other sorts of calls when they, like if they're clasped and don't want to be. So, but up the upper right, we have a Xenopus laevis, which is a well-known African clawed frog. It's well-known because it's been studied by scientists very consistently, I guess, in a bunch of different types of scientific fields. And it's kept as a pet. And the females have a sort of clicking vocalization. They make a rapping sound to indicate sexual interest, and they make a ticking sound to indicate disinterest. So I was not able to find audio files for that, unfortunately. But I did find an audio file for the concave-eared torrent frog, female, and I have a little video here. So that's what it's like at full speed. You can see that's up here at around 8,000 hertz, maybe 7,000 hertz. It's like an octave above the top of the piano. This is the highest note on the piano, here at about 4,000 hertz. So this is quarter speed. This would be 1/8 speed. See, it starts to sound like an owl maybe, and then even slower, 1/16 the speed, it really starts to sound like a wolf or a coyote. So let's talk about learning and memory in frog song. What I like to say, talent versus hard work or grit. So there is a lot of evidence for innateness of call production and listener preference. So if you take H. versicolor and H. chrysochelis, tadpoles, say, and you raise them, so like we take the H. versicolor frogs, right? These guys are closely related. We saw them before. Take these ones, the versicolor ones, and you raise them, and so that they only get to listen to heterospecific. They only get to listen to the calls of H. chrysochelis. And then vice versa, we take H. chrysochelis, young. They only ever get to hear H. versicolor songs. You can say, like, as adults, the H. versicolor, young, that only heard H. chrysochelis songs, what kinds of songs are they going to produce? Are they going to produce their own song, the versicolor songs, or are they going to produce the songs they heard, H. chrysochelis songs? Turns out they produce the songs of their species. That suggests that the song is biological. It's innate. They're born with the ability to produce their song and only their song, and hearing another song doesn't do anything, even though these are closely related species. So that's very interesting. That suggests strong innateness for call production, and then presumably suggests that listening doesn't change at all what at least what singers are going to do. But we'll see below that these studies haven't been conducted in females, at least as far as I know. So another thing you can do is look at hybrids. So H. chrysochelis and H. femoralis. Presumably these are they have to be two closely related species if they're able to produce hybrids. But the thing is, hybrids are not viable. That's what makes them hybrids. The definition of a species is that animals within a species can pretty much only mate with themselves. If they try to mate with animals of another species, the offspring are not viable. They either don't survive or they can't produce offspring. The offspring might survive and not be able to produce offspring, but you could still listen to them sing. So that's what happens here. You mate H. chrysochelis with H. femoralis. You can then the offspring are raised alone in isolation. They never hear any calls. Then when they grow up, they do produce calls, and they produce calls that sound halfway in between these two things. So that again suggests that there's a kind of like biological innateness to song structure, strong song sound. And then this is crickets as opposed to frogs, but when you deafen crickets, they still produce their species specific call. You could deafen them, at birth. So they don't crickets don't ever need to hear their song. In this cases, neither of the types of frogs needed to be able to hear their song in order to produce it. That all suggests it's innate. But there is some evidence for learning and memory in frogs. So American bullfrogs, you see one at the upper right there, can distinguish between advertisement calls from their territorial neighbors versus those of unfamiliar males. If it's a neighbor singing, the main bullfrog will counter call. Whereas if it's an unfamiliar neighbor, he'll make aggressive calls and maybe jump over to him and try to threaten him. So here's how this works in a real life scenario. We have this bullfrog here, and then he's hearing the sound of his neighbor somewhere around here. But let's say the neighbor is actually a speaker hiding in the bushes. So we're playing the sound of male A, neighbor A. And this guy is used to the sound of neighbor A. But if all of a sudden we change the call, so it's just, it's still a bullfrog, but it's just a different one than the one he heard, this guy will all of a sudden be like, what? And then jump over there and maybe try to fight him. So that means that this guy knows the call of the one neighbor and can tell when the call of a different neighbor comes in, even though they're all American bullfrogs. They all sound kind of the same to us. But this guy, that means that he's learning the call of his neighbor, and then he's able to remember it the whole time, remember that his neighbor is there, specific neighbor is there. And then Gerhardt, this is a long time ago, 1996, but in this article that I was reading, he says that studies of female preference of this sort are completely lacking. So we really don't know how much learning and memory factors into female preference for why she likes a certain song over another. We are ultimately going to watch a video of American bullfrogs, but on this screen. But first, let me just introduce this concept to you called the lek. So if you're a frog and you want to sing and compete with other frogs and find mates, you might be asking yourself this important existential question: to lek or not to lek? So say you're a solo frog singer-songwriter, You hope to connect intimately with an audience on a given night. You have two options. You could perform solo at a poorly attended venue, but for as long as you wish, in which case you would be something like a big frog and a small pond. Or you could perform a few songs throughout the night at a well-attended venue, but you'd have to share the stage with many other excellent performers. In that case, you'd be a small frog in a big pond. How do you know which is the better option? Well, it depends. How much more attractive is the well-attended establishment? Do you gain prestige just from being part of the multi-performer group, irrespective of how good your individual material is on its own merits? In this example, performing at the well-attended venue translates to singing in a lek. A lek is a gathering place where multiple advertising singers come together to try to individually attract audience interest. There are both benefits and drawbacks to joining a lek versus striking out on your own. Leks draw more audience members from farther away, but there's also more competition. And competition influences song performance in interesting ways. This is a male bullfrog. You can see the chorus is still going on in the background. He's going to start it up again. He's always going first for whatever reason. He's the leader. And the others will respond. These frogs are all in one place. Probably listening to each other's songs and interacting. So let's look at these interactions among singers, competition and cooperation. I've got a little picture here, and this is from the katydid, so this is an insect. But as I read the insect literature on chorusing, it's strikingly similar to the chorusing literature in frogs. I mean, it's very interesting. It suggests it's a feature of chorusing generally, not specific to a type of animal, which means it could relate to humans as well. So in this case, you have 4 different katydids here, and when they signal individually, the sound reaches about this far, and so with all 4, it's just reaching there. But when they're singing together at the same time, the sound travels farther. So if they want to collectively reach mates from farther away, they can signal at the same time. So, and here you can see this is the sound that a single cricket or katydid would make. And it's reaching this amount of amplitude, whereas it goes much higher in amplitude, so it's much louder when all 4 of them are singing, and they're singing at exactly the same time. If they were staggered, it wouldn't be any louder. So that shows you how being cooperative can increase your ability to draw in mates from farther away. So frog singers perform differently according to the context they're in. If a chorus or lek size is small, lek is just the same thing, right? So the size of the number of people singing. If it's small, the singers might be more likely to cooperate, like you have with the crickets or with the katydids. If the chorus or lek size is large, the singers might be more likely to compete with one another. So in terms of cooperation, here's the logic. If you sing the same song at the same time as a nearby singer, you can increase the intensity and the range of the acoustic signal, like we see with the katydids. But you also kind of need to compete. If you sing at exactly the same time as others, your individual contribution will not be recognized. So in large choruses, it pays to sing slightly ahead of others. And that makes the entirety of the sound seem as if it's coming from you. It's a weird auditory illusion. But basically, if you can sing just milliseconds ahead of others, your listeners will mistake that the entirety of the sound is coming from your direction. But in small groups, just simply staggering your call to occur when your neighbor is between songs is effective. And that's what we saw with the bullfrog on the previous screen. And we're going to look at hocketing in humans on this screen. This is the dirty projectors.
Okay, yeah, that's a great idea. So Angel has the part that's on the beat. Amber has the part that's off the beat. You guys good with notes?
Yeah.
Ready? 3, 4. So these are literally just the upper notes of the chords.
So now let's explore what frogs listen for in music. Or, for the discerning frog song connoisseur, what to listen for in And You're in Music. This is a little joke because this is Aaron Copland. He wrote a book called What to Listen For in Music, by which we assume he means human music. But we can ask the same question about And You're in Music. What makes a frog sound good? Are we judging this by human standards or by frog standards? We could judge it by human standards, and it's true that some of those songs sound more interesting to us, but I do think it's definitely important and interesting to ask this from the frog perspective. So how do you know if a frog listener likes a certain song? With humans, you could say, do you like that song by the Dirty Projectors? And the person could say, yes, they like it, or no, they don't like it, and then you could say why. And we tend to think that the why question is very interesting, and that's more interesting than just liking. So if you play a show and someone comes up and said they like it, then you might think like, oh, well, tell me something interesting. But it really is interesting. It really is a much more complex phenomenon than we tend to think. If you do like something, you can go into the details about why you like it. But if you don't like it, it just means it didn't really work. So we're kind of talking about what makes a frog song work. If you like it, you might hop toward it. You might agree to mate with the person singing it, or you might join in by singing it with them or singing something else in response. If you dislike it, you might hop away from it, or you might simply ignore it. And those are complex processes. So I want to bring up these two terms, just noticeable difference and just meaningful difference. And these are used in the scientific literature. The first one's really common. Just noticeable difference is the smallest difference between two signals that can be detected. So let's say I have the tone ah and another tone ah. Those are far enough away. The second one is higher, and you can tell the difference. But if I had ah and ah, I was actually trying to sing that just a tiny, tiny bit away, it might be too close for you to be able to tell the difference. So the just noticeable difference is how different the signals have to be for the difference to be detected. But something different is the just meaningful difference, which is the smallest difference between two signals that alters a behavioral response. That could be how much you like it. I was thinking of an example. If you're in your violin lesson and you play a certain note, and if it's just a tiny bit out of tune, it might not even sound like it's out of tune at all. The teacher might be able to tell the difference, tell that the note is out of tune, but not enough to stop you and say, whoa, let's get that note in tune, or let's prescribe some exercises to work on the tuning of that note, right? So the noticeable difference might be a lot smaller than the meaningful difference. The meaningful difference might be like, whoa, that's out of tune enough that it's really changing how the whole performance is working. So, and then the difference could be in the feeling of the performance or in the teacher's decision to stop you and work on it. So now let's think about what frogs themselves listen for in music. One thing that they're asking is this my own species I'm hearing? If you think about it, a frog doesn't know what species it is, right? It just knows that it kind of likes a certain song, and it might hop toward it when it's feeling a certain way, like it's got eggs in its belly that it wants to lay, something like that. But as I mentioned, hybrids between two species are not, like by definition, they're not viable. And so frogs have evolved ways to be very selective in trying to figure out whether another singer is of their species or not. And that's why two closely related species that are in the same place often have very different vocalization calls. So it seems that one of the main things that an advertisement call in frogs does is say which species they are. So a listener, one of the main things that they must be doing is saying like, oh, is this the right species or not? They're not going to consciously say that, but they're probably built biologically to be tuning out the wrong sounds and tuning into the right sounds. And if they don't, like the offspring just don't survive or aren't able to mate. So that's why if the female has interest in the sounds of the wrong species, any offspring she makes with that other species aren't really going to reproduce. Okay, most hybrids don't survive and cannot mate. And as I mentioned, it's difficult. So biologically, two closely related species will be able to produce the same types of sounds, but the timing of the sounds is an easier thing to change. So, and with human music, I think this is interesting because we tend to think it's the specific notes that are different between pieces. But if you think about it, we use always the same 12 notes. We use the same chords pretty much, but we order them in different ways and we time them in different ways. So da-da-da-dum is different from da-da-da-dum. Well, da-da-da-dum. It's very different from that, right? The timing really influences what the notes mean. So another thing that a listener might be asking is this a good representation of the species call? Will our offspring be able to produce and recognize this good representation of the call? If you decide to mate with someone who's not producing a good representation of the call, presumably your offspring will also not be producing a good representation, and maybe they won't be able to mate. So even if the call doesn't signal any value in the mate at all, except that it can produce the call, or it can recognize the call, then that still can matter. So is the singer going to pass on good mating ritual genes? Just the ability to do the mating ritual, even if the mating ritual is arbitrary. And this only matters to the extent that the call production and recognition are innate. If it was learned, it wouldn't matter. But if it's innate, it matters. If it's in the genes. Okay, and then is the singer in good health? You might be listening for this and therefore likely to pass on good health genes. So the size of the body, right, is translated in the frequency, fundamental frequency, and also the timbre of the sound. The energy expenditure of the act of singing, of calling, so how frequently that song is being sung, how long the song is, long or short call, maybe how loud it is. And then is the singer nearby? This is actually important. Extended searches for a mate are pretty dangerous. You wouldn't think so because you kind of think like how dangerous could it be to hop a few extra hops? But apparently it is. So females tend to choose singers that are nearby. So they really are impressed by a louder signal, which happens to be closer to them. So if they're coming from farther away, then the loudness of a call or its participation in a chorus will be the female would be more able to hear and to locate and to hop toward. So that's why participating in a chorus is really valuable. So that's something frogs end up listening for in music. Okay, and finally we have this interesting question to ask about who is in charge. Do singers drive the evolution of listeners or vice versa? So let's talk about how speciation happens. We mentioned this briefly. Sometimes it'll happen by accident, so a barrier could be introduced between two different populations. So let's say there's frogs all around the Bosque area on both sides of the Rio Grande, and all of a sudden like a big glacier forms in the Rio Grande and separates the two populations for many thousands or millions of years. Then they'll end up, the breeding pools will be separated and they'll end up as two different species. When they come together again, they won't be able to mate. It can also be functional. So if you had a gene in you that made you, I'm just going to skip that one, but basically it could happen by accident or it can sort of improve the success of the two individual species if they end up separating. So frogs do end up speciating fairly rapidly among species, and they do this, it turns out, in part by distinguishing their songs from one another. So sometimes a change in the biology of hearing or singing could induce a change in the song, but more commonly it would be the arbitrary aspects of song structure that would change well before the biology would catch up. So let's say two groups are separating from one another. It's difficult to invent new biology that can produce new sounds, but it's not that hard for the songs to become more distinct that would end up separating the groups from one another. So in particular, closely related species sharing a habitat often have markedly different song structure. When courtship song behavior evolves, you then might ask, who is driving the change? Is it the singer that's changing the song and then listeners catch up, or is it the listeners are changing their preferences and singers catch up? In principle, it could be either one, right? Either singers could start changing their songs and listeners would catch up, or vice versa. And then environment is playing a huge role in this as well. So natural surroundings, like a noisy stream, might influence either how loud, whether your song can be heard at all, or which frequencies you might end up using or stressing. And then other species present. So if other species are communicating in a certain frequency range that's blocking sounds that had been in your communication repertoire before, you might end up changing either the timing or the frequency range spectrum of your song to adjust to that situation. And again, that could be driven by either the listeners or the singers. It seems like it's always going to be a chicken or the egg question, meaning it's always both. There isn't one that comes first, but there are researchers that do try to figure out whether a listener evolves a new capacity to hear song in like to choose to like a different kind of song, or vice versa. And I do think that that's interesting stuff, and it's certainly an interesting question for human music because we have cultural evolution that happens much faster than biological evolution. And it is interesting to ask, is it bands, say, like new bands producing new sounds that create new listeners, or is it vice versa, that new listeners are listening for new things and they end up elevating bands that are already doing that kind of thing? So there's got to be feedback happening both ways, but it is interesting to think about how those relationships work. So in this who's in charge question, we can look at a couple of examples of female listener-driven song evolution. So this is, again, assuming that males are the singers, females are the listeners. Females are usually larger in frogs. So on the right there, you can see a little male on the back of a big female. So the fundamental frequency could change. This would be like the pitch height. If a larger male body size is preferred by females because the offspring of larger males would tend to be more successful in that species, then females might evolve a preference for lower than average fundamental frequency because body size correlates with pitch height and resonance. So they're listening for that. This could then feed back to males actually becoming larger over time. So we start with the fact that it's actually healthier for offspring to be a little bit bigger. Then that leads to a preference in females. Preference in females for lower sounding song. And then that leads in males to males singing lower. They might actually sing lower in their range as well. Yeah. So it might induce males to sing lower in the range or compose new variants of song that show off the lower range, the buffo range. Repetition rate, envelope periodicity. So if a neighboring closely related species, let's say, is likely to be mistaken for one's own, right? And if hybrid offspring of the two species are less viable, then specific listener sensitivities to the difference between the two calls could develop. So if the two species have songs that are fairly similar, but slightly different in terms of, let's say, timing, repetition rate of pulses, then listeners might become more sensitive to those differences over time. And then those differences might then become stronger. So the differences are most likely to be temporal, like we said, since the timing of sounds produced is more readily changeable than are the characteristics of the sounds themselves, like how the sounds are produced and what timbres they produce. As females develop slight sensitivities to these differences, male signalers may develop more dramatic differences in their signaling behavior, which can lead to a runaway evolutionary process ending when the changes reach the limits, either vocal capacity or listener sensitivity. So if you take the example above of females starting to prefer lower pitch in vocalizations, at some point it's going to bottom out. Either the males will start singing so low that the females can't even hear it, which is sort of unlikely. So more likely is that there's a certain limit to which the male body could produce the lower song, or having too big of a male body is bad for some other reason. So there's going to be some limit usually. But in different frog species, sometimes females prefer an average fundamental frequency in male song, and then sometimes they do prefer the lower frequency no matter how low it goes. So if you generate a call in the laboratory that's lower than any real male can perform, females might like that better. And then we can look at metabolic investment. So if metabolic capacity is important for the offspring in a given ecological situation, sensitivity in females to the degree of energetic investment of male singers could evolve in the form of a preference for longer songs or higher rates of singing a given song. So in conclusion, it's not easy being green. A huge number of frog species use vocalization to navigate courtship. Primarily, this is a nighttime strategy where an auditory beacon is needed. This is because frogs breed predominantly at night and visual signals don't really work, right? So you need an auditory signal. But singing is costly and dangerous. It requires a massive amount of energy. We saw 100 to 220% more energy than not singing. It attracts predators and parasites. We didn't talk about parasites, but there are parasites that listen for song and then find their hosts that way. So it really is dangerous to sing, and it can be bad for the health, and it wastes a lot of energy. But it's the same sounds that you would make to help mates locate you that also help predators and parasites locate you. So everything that you do that's good about song is also bad. It attracts attention. And the social life of a singing frog, it's not a simple one. It really is complex. And we get that from Kermit, right? Like, even though he sings that it's not easy being green, he likes being green. Yeah, it's a complex situation. So singing alone might seem nice, like Kermit is doing, but it could be fruitless. Maybe no one will come to your concert. Singing in a group can be great because you attract more attention, but it requires cooperation and coordination. And I suppose competition isn't there. So you got to learn who your neighbors are by recognizing their specific songs. We at least know one species, the American bullfrog, does that. You might sometimes sing in alternation with your neighbors when the group is small enough to allow individual hocketed contributions, like we saw with the dirty projectors and also bullfrogs. You might sing in the chorus when the group is large, aiming to synchronize. And that's just like we saw with the katydids, where they're exactly aligning their signal and it gets much louder. But you also want to be just the slightest bit ahead of everyone else, and that will help when a female does come into the range of being able to choose between members of the chorus. If you're just a little bit ahead, she's more likely to come to you. And then, as if all of that were not enough, you probably don't even know what species you are a member of. I mean, it's got to be the case. So you might have certain hunch that you kind of like a certain sound a little bit better than a certain other sound, but you don't even know what a species is. You don't know intellectually that some other member that's calling that maybe looks like you and everything is, a different species. So yeah, it's not easy. But I hope you enjoyed this discussion of what it's like to be a frog and to sing. And thanks for being here.